Welcome to the PM Hive Podcast. This is episode 3. This is your co-host again, Kasey. Today we have another very special guest. His name is Steven. He is a product manager at Mozilla. And today we're going to be talking a lot about how Steven got into product management, his diverse background in both academia and music production, and a lot of other cool stuff. And then finally, we're going to touch on how people with non-traditional backgrounds, and this is obviously a very, a specific area that we're really passionate about as a community, how, people can kind of crack the chicken and egg problem and get into product management, which is a very fun and lucrative role in tech now. So today, Steven, I just wanted to ask you, and right off the bat, before we can begin, just a quick moment for you to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Steven. I don't know why I wasn't prepared for that question. So my name's Steven Flach, and I am currently in a product management role at Mozilla. I'm actually working on an internal product, so I'm working on their enterprise application management team. So basically, the team that manages all of the software that the employees at the company are using to do their jobs. And I'm fairly new to that role. Prior to that, I was at Mozilla working on their virtual reality platform, which is called Mozilla Hubs. I was in a project management role at that time. And and prior to that, I did a whole bunch of things that I was at a startup. And then before that, I was not even in the tech sector. And maybe we'll get more into that later.
Yeah, Steven obviously has a very diverse and rich background, so I think we can probably do small chunks of it one by one. I know that was kind of like a curveball to you, but first of all, I kind of wanted to just ask you, and this is probably a more standard question, is maybe if you're able to describe your story of how you got into product management in the first place. Obviously with your non-traditional background, it's very interesting because a lot of people, and especially a lot of folks in our PM Hive community, come to me and ask, do we need an MBA for this? Do I need a PMP for this? Do I need specific technical experience, developer experience, all that sort of stuff? It's obviously a very complicated issue, but it's also, something that we love talking about. So if you want to describe kind of how you got into product management, that would be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. It's definitely been a non-linear and non-traditional path. When I was much younger, I was a professional musician for a bunch of years. And, you might be thinking, what does that have to do with what you do now? And to be honest, I don't it's not on my resume or anything, but if you think about, I was in a band for 10 years that was making records and touring a lot. And if you actually break down what somebody in a group like that is doing, because it was a self-managed group as well. So you're making records, you're going into the studio, you're booking tours, you're going out and actually executing the tours, but both of those things are project management, right? And particularly the studio work, because there's money involved and it's time bound, and things have to happen in a particular sequence. So that's all happening. But then on the product side too, you're essentially as a band, of course we didn't think of it this way at the time. We were like an indie band, right? So we weren't thinking of it in kind of product terms, but really, when I look back on it, it's like, oh, we were managing a product, we were managing a brand. That band had a particular place in a niche market, and that identity needed to be managed, and so there was kind of a constant managing going on with that, and positioning ourselves. As, like I said, that group was around for 12 years. I was with them for 10. And within 12 years in the indie scene, there's a lot of trends come and go. So you're kind of constantly figuring out how to navigate that. So that was that part. I went back to school. I studied music kind of towards the end of that, and then transferred and did a communication degree. When I was doing communication, I got interested in organizational behavior and did a directed study that was an organization and analysis. So that was sort of starting me on this path.
Right.
I did some consulting around communication and organization analysis for arts nonprofits. Did that for a bit, and then I took a full-time position at the university that I was at, and worked in administration there for a bunch of years. And again, never had a title of product manager or project manager or anything, but I was regularly managing projects, kind of special projects, right? So then eventually wound up in tech, really by accident. A friend of mine had founded a startup with another fellow, and they had been going for, I don't know, probably 6 or 8 months or more. And he was telling me that they were just kind of disorganized. They didn't really have documentation. They didn't have processes, and he knew that was something I excelled at. And he asked if I'd come and work for them, so I did that. Wound up eventually, I was telling somebody earlier today, actually, that I think the first 6 or 8 months I was there, I didn't have a title. Like, basically nobody had titles, and I think that's not completely uncommon in startups. And so was doing wearing a lot of different hats. Eventually, we settled on technical operations manager. But really, I was doing a lot of kind of business analysis work. I was running projects. I wasn't the main project manager, but there were projects I was running from time to time, and giving a lot of feedback on product decisions. And actually, a lot of that piece I missed that I wanted to talk about was that whole time that I was kind of working, like I was a student, and then I was working in university administration. When I was doing consulting, I was using software that whole time. And at the university, I was using enterprise level software a lot. I became a bit of an Excel guru, right? And that has been a huge bonus, like coming into product, because it's like I've been on that user end a lot. I understand the mentality of somebody who's not an engineer, who is using a product, as maybe an advanced user, or maybe a beginner user even, depending on the software. So that was something, even when I was working in, I didn't mention I was working in virtual reality, I don't think, but even in that field, which I didn't have a background in, I was able to bring that user empathy in, and had kind of a different perspective than the two founders of the startup I was at, who were, they'd been in that field for nearly a decade at that point. So there's a lot of stuff they were taking for granted. And then the other folks were more technical or designers or what have you. So I just had a different perspective. So, and when I moved to Mozilla, I was similarly able to deploy that kind of perspective, and it was helpful in both organizations. So.
I don't know if this is probably the first time that you had to kind of go through the whole journey of, you stumbling across from audio to, being part of a band, indie band for, which is awesome, right? And then going into academia and then transitioning and perhaps even, for lack of a better word, stumbling into the technical operations manager role that you described, finally into product, into a kind of modern tech company. Fascinating journey, obviously, because you could dissect that and we could spend hours talking about every piece of it. I wanted to ask more specifically, when you discovered that, project management and kind of that entire realm of managing projects, managing products, understanding the users better, being that Excel guru, do you kind of have like a point in time where you just realize that this is more, the path that you wanted to do, as opposed to just staying in academia, or as opposed to touring with your indie band still? Because very, very, very different fields, right? So it's always, I'm sure it's probably something that people have been curious about.
Sure, yeah. Well, the kind of professional musician piece for me just kind of ran its course. It just, after a number of years, it's not an easy life. It's very rewarding in a lot of ways, but it's a grind. You never have money. You're usually working another job. You're traveling a lot. So it's hard to really get your feet under you in other parts of your life. So I just there just became a point I wasn't really enjoying it anymore. So that was a transition. And then, yeah, like going into studying communication and getting into that stuff, coming out with my BA, I was in my 30s when I got my BA. Ironically, having gotten into the organizational behavior stuff, and where I saw my career going at that point was more into consulting, or maybe going into nonprofit arts management or something like that. Really where I thought my career might go at that point would be more into business analysis. And that was like, even for years, like I was doing a lot of business analysis work in the different jobs that I had. And that's kind of where I saw myself heading if I was going to go do more training and do that thing. Essentially what happened in terms of moving into project management and then product management was being in that operations role, but wearing a lot of hats, still doing a lot of BA work. And when that company was acquired, they kind of looked at the employees that were working for that startup and decided, okay, not everybody made it, unfortunately, but they decided who would be joining the team, who would be a useful addition to the team. And they hired me and they gave me the title of project manager. And at which point I was telling somebody earlier today that having just come from the meetup, that's why it's not like I talk about this stuff all the time, like in just, at the gas station and stuff, right? But it was really, I'd been running projects, like I was saying, I'd been managing projects for years, right? But I had no formal training in it. So when I got hired as a project manager at a established tech company, there's a lot of anxiety that actually came with that. And I know this isn't the path most people take, right? It's like, okay, you're a this now, My life's been like that a lot, actually, though. And so then it was like, oh, I better figure out what this means here, like what does project manager mean at an established software company versus the kind of the way I'd been doing it previously, which was more organic. And, we were using project management software and, I knew some techniques, but so really studied up on Agile and Scrum and eventually moved into a Scrum Master role. And found I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did. I didn't think I'd enjoy being a project manager, but I really liked working with a development team. It was, and it turned out I was like pretty good at it. So and then moving into product, again, it was just sort of an opportunity that came up, and I decided to step into it. And I think in a lot of ways, I might be better suited for that in a lot of ways. Again, bringing in that customer empathy piece. When I was doing the project management, I was a Scrum Master and product owner as well. I found I really enjoyed the product owner work that I was doing. So that was definitely a draw in terms of moving into product. Like, oh, actually, being able to kind of, be the person with the final say on the product, obviously based on data and research and all that kind of stuff. And
one of the questions that I used to kind of had to deal with a lot back in college was when I first came up with the idea of a project manager versus product manager. That was kind of always the question that I asked my mentors and my hiring managers during co-ops and internships was, what's the difference between project and product managers, right? Biggest thing that I've kind of learned throughout my kind of 4-ish years of product experience was project managers obviously deal more with the timelines, execution of a handed delivery of project or software work that's being done throughout a scheduled course. And then this is kind of a little bit different compared to product management, in which you want to be more focused on discovery work, user empathy, identifying the problem before you're just told to solve that said problem and then go through some sort of execution, right, of actually getting the work done. So I kind of that's when I realized that was kind of like the nuance between project and product, not necessarily nuance because it's a very big differentiator. Is that kind of like, does that kind of resonate with you? Is that how you kind of discovered product ownership over just the general project manager responsibilities you were doing?
I mean, what you're saying resonates as accurate. But I mean, again, to be completely honest, when I moved into the project management role and, moved into basically what happened, the team I was on, the engineering manager of the development team was promoted to team lead. That team had 2 development teams, so he became the full team lead. There's 30 people on that team. And there was a gap there that needed to be filled. So that was when they asked me to actually step in and take over a team that didn't have a full-time engineering manager. And the other thing that had happened was the product manager for that 30-person team had also left. So while I was there were vacancies, essentially. There were gaps to be filled. And I was fortunate enough that because, like I said, with my background coming in, the way I always worked was you just do what needs to be done and you figure it out as you go. So that was kind of the mentality I had coming in. And not having the formal training, that was what I did. And then as I went along, I figured out like, oh, these are the differentiations of the different roles here. And, after a particular amount of time, I realized, oh, okay, I've been doing product owner work. I've been doing Scrum Master work. That was pretty obvious, But and also actually, I didn't realize this at the time, but the program manager on that team told me, he's like, well, you've been the program manager on this team for the last several months. Because he said, I handed it off to you. I've been doing other stuff. You've been doing that too. So it was really for me it was coming into it from a place of ignorance really, and just doing the work that needed to be done. So now kind of doing more formal study in the last few months. And really kind of having a better understanding of what that breakdown of responsibilities is. And it's very much, I see it very much as a handoff as well, right? Between product and project.
So quick whimsical remark in the fact that you've touched all the P's, product, project, and program. That's pretty cool. I guess second question, because one of your previous answers kind of touched on this, was when you first transitioned into a startup company, right? And you said, obviously, tech company with academia, with, traveling in a van with an indie band and all that stuff, obviously various different stuff. But when you started in a startup and now that you're at Mozilla, a relatively more stable, larger tech company, did you find that there were any kind of big differentiators, or I guess from your experience as a PM in a startup versus as a PM in a larger company like Mozilla, there has to be a lot of different things you could probably talk about in terms of how it's different, the stability of it, the stress, the risk, obviously all that stuff in between.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say that, I think the main difference is just that, I think every startup's going to be different as well, right? Because some startups are going to be started by people who have started several startups in their lives and have taken those startups through the different stages, right? So the founders of those companies are going to be running a different kind of shop, I think, than younger founders. So the startup I was at was the founders were in their early to mid 30s, which is younger than I am. Which was also interesting because then I was able to actually bring a different perspective from the experience too, right? That they found valuable. But yeah, I'd say the main difference is the moving into a larger company is just that everything's a lot more formalized, right? And that the startup I was at was very bootstrappy. It was just okay, yeah, we're pulling together, we're getting stuff done, and and there was experience there, but we weren't using a lot of the industry terminology around the project management language and that kind of thing. I'm remembering now though, actually, when I did move into it, it seemed like there was a lot of industry jargon, and I'd be sitting on Zoom calls and like Googling terms a lot. But reflecting back now, after I joined Mozilla, it was like, Mozilla is an established company, so they were hiring people with a lot of industry experience, and so everybody had that kind of baseline of like, the tech industry is a very specific culture with a very specific nomenclature, and so people had that. And again, then I was in a new setting, more of a development setting. Just Googling terms in meetings, and that was a big thing, just the formalism and the specificity of the roles. Like I said, in the startup, you've got a small group of people, and everybody, you're just trying to solve problems, really, right? And it's just all hands on deck. People jumping into different situations at different times that require different skill sets, and it's just often just who has the skill set, who has the bandwidth, and who has the skill set to take this on, right? Whereas at a larger company on a larger team, it's like people are very specialized. Like where the design team I worked with, I think if I recall correctly, there were 7 people on it or something, right? And it was very much a
wow.
It was very much a funnel, or a pipeline, right? Like, like starting at the beginning and working down to UX,
0 to 1.
Yeah. Yeah, and through systems designer, somebody specialized in that, and like a UX researcher on that team as well. That would have been the entry point.
The stuff that you need PhDs for at that point.
A lot of training and a lot of experience on that team.
I remember, kind of to your point, because while we're on this topic, during my internship at Unity Technologies, they had an entire department just for user experience researchers, what you described. These folks all had PhDs, or at least had a master's in this kind of field, very niche. But when we worked with them, they made sure that when we worked with specific clients or users or customers, so to speak, we would have to schedule, like, for example, 40 to 45-minute calls with them. We'd have to fill out a whole template just for the user research piece of it, right? Like what questions we're going to ask the user, how, the whole methodology and the procedure of how they're going to test our product, who's going to share screens, who's going to keep quiet during these, the questions and answering. And then during the actual call itself with the user, it amazed me that the user experience researcher, obviously the guy knew what he was doing, but he kept quiet the entire user test. Just a really interesting remark I want to bring out, because that's when I realized like there's so many best practices and pieces out there that I didn't realize that was kind of functional and part of this entire role. So anyways, actually to your point, obviously there's, when you're joining a large tech company like, Mozilla or Unity, there's a lot of tech, niche specific tech roles that you kind of described out there that you don't realize there are. In a startup, you're just working all hands on deck, who has the best skill set, get it done, more chaotic, more hectic. My next question, I guess, while we're kind of on this topic itself, is I guess with Mozilla, I think you mentioned that you were working with VR stuff. The question popped up to my head because while I was at Unity, we got to also touch. My product was not VR, but I got to ask a lot of interview a lot of people who are in that field. Kind of like what your thoughts on like in terms of working as a product manager in the VR space, because last year, as you knew, everyone was talking about the metaverse, so to speak, quote unquote, how that probably kind of impacted
We've moved on from that now.
We have, but I guess like it was kind of fun while it lasted, while you're in that kind of pivotal role at Mozilla. So if you're able to kind of describe the daily activities or how you thought of your work as a PM in that VR space.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, one thing when you're just talking about that, this isn't directly related to your question, but it's kind of peripheral to your question. Like one of the things, actually maybe going back to what we were talking about a bit earlier in terms of like people coming into the field and like trying to figure out how to transition into the field, right? And a lot of my experience with that has been about leveraging the experience that I have, right? And basically, essentially finding ways to take the experience I have and frame it, like reframe it in terms of in terms of the industry,
right,
and in terms of what's needed there. And so one thing that happened that was interesting, because I had the audio background and the music background, I wound up actually doing part of my job in both of those companies. Wound up being doing sound design for VR spaces, which I loved. And every time I did that, I'd be sitting there and I'd be like, I can't believe I'm getting paid really well to do this work that I trained for years, right? Like I was in school,
right?
I lived in the studio for a long time when I was in school. So that was very cool. That's not traditionally part of a PM role, but it was more just like, well, nobody else has the skill set on this team.
It's your skills kind of getting repurposed, I guess, for if we want to find a word to describe it. Like, I feel like a lot of people with their kind of very diverse backgrounds find ways to repurpose their skills, whether it's domain expertise or actual hands-on expertise like you described. Quick shout out, by the way, I know like I was going to save this for the end of the podcast, but Stephen helped edit our second episode of our PM Hive podcast. I know Netta's in the room looking at me with a big wide-eyed face. Yeah, so big shout out. So obviously, like, that's kind of where, it exemplifies this audio production experience actually hands-on being very useful for us. But yeah, anyways, back to my question.
Yeah, I enjoy it. So
yeah,
and I'm not doing it right now. For part of my job, so it's nice to keep my hands in it.
I guess now that you say like you're not doing it as part of your job as much as you probably were when you were doing the VR stuff, when you transitioned away from the VR product management back to regular product management, and I guess this kind of just ties back into like my general question of how do you find product management in Mozilla in the first place. A few folks have kind of asked me, or not necessarily asked me, but I've seen kind of curiosity out there during our meetups and stuff is, hey, it sounds really cool to work for Mozilla in the first place. Obviously, most folks only know it for the foundation or for Firefox.
Yeah.
But in general, right, you guys do a lot more than just that. So from a product management functionality standpoint, if you're able to kind of speak to what you kind of do on a daily basis, anything of the sort, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, the role I'm in now, I've only been in a few weeks, right? So, most of, I'm putting product management experience in air quotes. Most of the experience I have is holding a project management title and carrying out some of those responsibilities. And it's interesting. I'm still figuring out what this role that I'm in now is going to be. It's a new role. I joined the enterprise application management team at Mozilla. And so it's a very different space than the VR space. Like this is, so enterprise application management is basically all the software that the employees in the company are using to do their work.
Right.
The team I'm on manages that software and then takes requests and does analysis to decide, okay, what new tools should we bring in as people request them, and basically trying to make people's jobs easier, which is kind of a through line in the work that I've done. And so it's interesting already there because it's an internal product, right? So it's a product that is there's no customers, it's there's stakeholders,
right?
But the stakeholders are internal teams, and so. Since I've been in that role, it hasn't been a long time. So most of what I've been doing so far is just getting familiar with the ecosystem. So really, again, that kind of goes back to more of the BA work and again, like lurking internally at internal processes and systems and stuff. So again, that's part of it. And when I did my interview process, they talked about the need for that, and that's part of my background and skill set. It's probably one of the stronger parts of my background and skill set. So that's kind of the work that I've been doing initially. And then from there, it's going to be going out into the broader concentric circles, right? And starting to look at external stakeholders. But yeah, like really, really treating that, I'd say there's multiple products there actually, because we have different teams.
Wow.
Doing, like there's an AV team, and then there's a team that just manages human resources software. and then there's another team that kind of handles the other stuff.
Right.
And they have different stakeholders. So there's, it's going to be segmented. And yeah, be a lot of research involved there. So that's kind of been my experience there. With hubs, it was an interesting space as well. And I'd say a lot of Mozilla products are like this in that, because the structure of Mozilla is that it's a nonprofit foundation that runs it. And then there's the Mozilla Corporation that has products and has revenue and pays taxes and that kind of thing. But there's no shareholders, right? The corporation answers to the foundation. So Hubs was an open source VR platform project. Very community built up around that. Very early access, like early adopters type community.
Yeah.
A lot of very creative people in that community. So there was, when I joined that team, there was a product manager who left shortly after I joined, but that would have been performing more of the functional product management roles. But there were also a couple of community managers on that team, and they would have done a lot of the kind of like directly community-facing work, right? And they were the people that were supplying a lot of the feedback from the community. So there was one that was working directly with a developer community, because that was a big part. Like I said, it was a very technical community. So they were, folks that were working with the open source code base and doing that kind of work. And then, and then another community manager working more with a lot of artists and educators and stuff. So that was, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but it was, that's kind of how I saw the product management role being handled there.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to derail the conversation because we're almost at time, but I do want to make a few remarks. One is, first of all, I can totally relate when it comes to building in-house software to manage like a platform of sorts to serve other feature owners of feature products or some sort of responsibility, like a value stream of sorts within the organization itself. You're not necessarily building for customers, you're building for stakeholders, right? How we worked at Microsoft, we had this thing called the Web Data Platform. We're browsing the internet, we're wrangling like the top 40 billion URLs of the internet and trying to make sense out of it. We have a whole, like systems and databases and all that sort of stuff. Our job was to take requirements from the feature teams or other corporate entities of sorts within the organization, take their requirements, prioritize, build out what needs to be built in the form of KRs, and then try to execute it. And it was always weird to me because it was very hard to tie our efforts to the end, daily active users goals, revenue, all that sort of stuff. It's very difficult to tie that connection, if you know what I mean, because you're building for stuff, but you're not necessarily finding the incentive to understand where your impact is going, if that kind of makes sense. So that was kind of just like my, I guess I can kind of empathize a little bit with what you're describing. I'm sure like obviously the systems and the impact was a bit different, but anyhow, so that's pretty much it. My final question to you before we kind of wrap up this podcast. First of all, there's the answers have been amazing, very high quality. My last question is just more so like for those, and I'm sure you kind of touched upon a lot of different points anyways across your answers, but if you're able to think of any piece of advice you can provide to our listeners today on how they can break into product management from a diverse background, of course, because everyone comes from different backgrounds when they're trying to break into product or PM, project management, program management. It seems like everyone, including yourself, kind of went through that journey. So if there's any lasting piece of advice you can provide, that'd be awesome. Yeah,
I would actually one little anecdote that something that I was thinking about just now. Not having the formal training and coming in. I've kind of joked with people during my interviews that like my project management mentor, probably the biggest one is Duke Ellington. And I don't know if you're familiar with Duke Ellington, but he was a big band leader.
Wow.
Big band jazz band leader in the 1930s and 40s. I think he went beyond that, but that's kind of when he was at his heyday. And I learned about him in music school. And the thing with Duke Ellington was he his band was known as just being a really, really good band, like innovative, tight, and the difference between him and a lot of the people around that era was that he was writing directly for the musicians in his band. You know, he knew who the players were, and that's who he was writing to. And that really landed with me. So that and doing a lot of improvisational music, right? So it's kind of bringing those mentalities from music into project management initially that actually went a long way, you know. So to actually sort of ties into the answer to your question, which is I would say, you know, for folks, I'd say, you know, I mean, it depends where you're at in your career, right? Like if you're really, really early career, like get some formal training and kind of go that route, right? Like it might be a PMP, you know, whatever, however you want to do it. But for folks that have been around longer, you've got, like, I'd say by nature, if you've been around a while and you're even looking at this career, you probably have some aptitude for it. You probably have a lot of experience doing that kind of work, even if you haven't held the title. And so, you know, I would really explore that, you know, and look into your resume and your volunteer experience too, and life experience, hobbies, whatever it is. And kind of look for those places where you have that experience, kind of like I was talking about with the band, you know. But, you know, also in, you know, doing that through your career, and find a way to kind of, again, you know, kind of frame that work through the lens of product and you know, whatever P you're getting into. So doing that, but also getting familiar with the industry terminology and the methodologies and frameworks, right? So it might mean reading some books about, if you're in software, it might mean reading some books about Agile and Scrum, or, you know, doing some certification courses through Scrum Alliance or scrum.org, learning that terminology and figuring out how the work that you've done fits into that. So that way, when you're writing your cover letter and your resume, you're going into interviews, you can talk to the people interviewing you in the in language that they want to hear. And you're hitting all the keywords that the AI bots are searching for in your resume. So so that would be kind of a starting point, I think.
No, that's awesome. It's a great piece of advice that you're kind of drawing in from your past experience too. So that kind of wraps up today's episode. We're hitting almost, I think, the 35 to 40-ish minute mark. Thank you again for tuning in today. Again, a big thank you for Stephen for being our special guest today and going through his entire plethora of experiences, because it's very rich, deep in both breadth and depth. So thank you again, Stephen, for joining me today and kind of setting up this entire podcasting kind of studio, so to speak, because we have new mics, we have a new setup going on. So the sound quality will definitely be better. So again, thank you for listening. And of course, we're going to have future guests and episode coming up. So please do stay tuned for that. And until next time, bye-bye.